Fairbanks, Alaska, 1997. A brutal murder shakes the community to its core.
The state has begun to review a 1997 Fairbanks murder case that led to the convictions of 4 Fairbanks Native men.
Ever since a Fairbanks teenager was beaten to death in 1997, the 4 Native men convicted of the crime have been fighting for their release. Well, tonight it looks like their fight will continue, even with
After 18 years in prison, one of the Fairbanks Four is returning to Interior Alaska on parole.
4 young Native men are swiftly arrested and convicted, their lives forever changed. But what if the real killers were still out there? Meet Jason Wallace and William Holmes, 2 men with a violent past and a dark secret. As we unravel the truth behind the Fairbanks Four case, you'll discover how a town's desperation for justice led to a grave miscarriage of it. Imagine spending 18 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. That's exactly what happened to Marvin Roberts, Kevin Pease, George Frese, and Eugene Vent, the Fairbanks Four. But their story doesn't end there. As we dig deeper into this case, we'll reveal the shocking evidence that was overlooked.
For the first time ever on camera, Bill Holmes sat down with me. He's the man at the center of the Fairbanks Four post-conviction relief case after he penned a confession that names himself and others as the actual assailants in the 97 John Hartman murder. Holmes began his interview by acknowledging he didn't start off as a hardened murderer.
The confessions that were coerced, and the real perpetrators who managed to escape justice for nearly 2 decades. Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew about this case? On the night of October 11th, 1997, the tranquil streets of Fairbanks, Alaska, were shattered by a crime that would cast a long shadow over the community. John Hartman, a 15-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him, was discovered beaten and unconscious on a dimly lit street corner. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the tight-knit town, leaving residents reeling and desperate for answers. The Fairbanks Police Department, feeling the weight of public pressure, scrambled to solve the case. Within days, they had arrested 4 young Native men: George Frese, Kevin Pease, Marvin Roberts, and Eugene Vent. These individuals, who would come to be known as the Fairbanks Four, found themselves at the center of a storm that would engulf their lives for nearly 2 decades. The prosecution's case against the Fairbanks Four was built on a foundation of sand. Eyewitness testimony, notoriously unreliable in the best of circumstances, formed the cornerstone of their argument. One witness claimed to have seen the attack from her hotel window, despite the fact that the crime scene was not visible from her vantage point. Another witness, himself a suspect in an unrelated crime, provided a statement implicating the 4 men in exchange for leniency in his own case. Perhaps most troubling were the confessions obtained from Eugene Vent and George Frese. These statements, taken during lengthy interrogations without legal representation present, were later alleged to have been coerced. Vent, who was just 17 at the time, had a blood alcohol level of 1% when he was questioned, raising serious concerns about the validity of his statements. Despite the glaring lack of physical evidence linking the Fairbanks Four to the crime scene, the prosecution pushed forward. No DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon were ever found to connect these men to Hartman's death. Yet, in a series of trials that concluded in 1999, all 4 were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Fairbanks community, shell-shocked by the violence that had invaded their town, embraced the verdicts without question. The swift resolution offered a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had been served and order restored. But as the years passed, cracks began to appear in the seemingly airtight case against the Fairbanks Four. Doubts started to surface, quietly at first, then with growing intensity. Advocates for the convicted men pointed out the racial undertones of the case, suggesting that the rush to judgment had been fueled by prejudice against Native Alaskans. The lack of physical evidence, once overlooked in the relief of having suspects behind bars, now loomed large in the minds of those who dared to question the official narrative. As the case began to unravel, a darker truth emerged from the shadows. The convictions, it seemed, had been based more on a desperate need for justice than on solid evidence. The community's desire for closure had outweighed the principles of due process and the presumption of innocence. The Fairbanks Four had become sacrificial lambs, offered up to appease a frightened public and a police force under immense pressure to solve a heinous crime. As the years wore on, the convictions of the Fairbanks Four began to unravel like a poorly knitted sweater. Marvin Roberts, one of the imprisoned men, had always maintained his innocence, insisting he was elsewhere on the night of John Hartman's murder. Alibi witnesses who had been inexplicably overlooked during the original trial started coming forward with their stories. These accounts painted a different picture of the night in question, one that placed Roberts far from the scene of the crime. The confessions of George Frese and Eugene Vent, once considered damning evidence, came under intense scrutiny. Legal experts and advocates raised concerns about the methods used to obtain these admissions. The lengthy interrogations, conducted without legal representation, began to look less like diligent police work and more like coercion. The fact that Vent had been questioned while intoxicated only added to the growing doubts surrounding the validity of his statement. In 2008, the Alaska Innocence Project took on the case, bringing fresh eyes and resources to the fight for justice. As they dug into the details, troubling inconsistencies emerged. The physical evidence, or rather the lack thereof, became a focal point. No DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon had ever linked the four men to Hartman's death. New forensic techniques, unavailable at the time of the original investigation, cast further doubt on the scant physical evidence that had been used to secure convictions. As the cracks in the case widened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge within the Fairbanks Police Department. Reports of racial bias and misconduct surfaced, suggesting that the rush to judgment in the Hartman case may have been fueled by prejudice against Native Alaskans. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism in their own backyard. The once unified front of Fairbanks residents, who had initially embraced the verdicts as justice served, began to fracture. Some clung to their belief in the Four's guilt, unwilling or unable to accept that such a grievous error could have been made. Others, swayed by the mounting evidence of a flawed investigation and trial, began to advocate for the men's release. The case that had once brought the community together now threatened to tear it apart. As doubts continued to grow, two names began to surface in connection with Hartman's murder: Jason Wallace and William Holmes. These men, with their own violent histories, had long been on the periphery of the case. Whispers and rumors about their involvement had circulated for years, but now those murmurs were growing louder, impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a shocking revelation that would turn the case on its head. The real killers, it seemed, had been hiding in plain sight for years, their guilt obscured by a rush to judgment and a flawed system of justice. As the Alaska Innocence Project pressed forward, the truth that had been buried for so long was about to come to light, promising to shake the foundations of Fairbanks and rewrite the narrative of one of Alaska's most infamous crimes. The truth that had been buried for so long was about to surface, but it would come from an unexpected source. As the Fairbanks Four languished behind bars, two men walked free, their consciences heavy with a secret that would shatter the foundations of the case. Jason Wallace and William Holmes, high school students at the time of John Hartman's murder, had led lives marked by violence and drug abuse that only escalated in the years following that fateful night. Wallace and Holmes were no strangers to trouble. Their teenage years were a blur of petty crimes and substance abuse, but as they grew older, their actions became increasingly violent. Wallace, in particular, developed a reputation for his volatile temper and unpredictable behavior. He was known to lash out at the slightest provocation, leaving a trail of battered victims in his wake. Holmes, on the other hand, was more calculated in his approach to crime, but no less dangerous. In 2003, 6 years after Hartman's murder, Wallace made a shocking confession to his public defender. He admitted to being involved in the brutal attack that took the young boy's life. The details he provided were chilling and specific, matching evidence from the crime scene that had never been made public. However, due to the constraints of attorney-client privilege, this crucial information remained locked away, allowing Wallace and Holmes to continue their lives while four innocent men sat behind bars. As the years passed, the weight of their guilt began to take its toll. Holmes, serving time for other murders he had committed, received an unexpected letter from Marvin Roberts, one of the Fairbanks Four. The letter, pleading for any information that could help prove their innocence, struck a chord with Holmes. Perhaps it was the realization of the lives he had ruined, or maybe it was a desire to clear his conscience. But Holmes decided it was time to come forward with his own confession. Holmes' account of that night in 1997 was disturbingly detailed.
And that was a part of me, but once I got involved in drug dealing, the mentality I had was that in order to be on top in the drug game, you had to be the most ruthless. So I chose to be, instead of being the prey, I chose to be the predator, and I took that to the max.
Holmes says he briefly left Alaska, and when he came back, all bets were off.
When I came back, I began to sell cocaine. I robbed somebody, and in that house, I thought there was only weed, but there ended up being cocaine. And from there, I just started selling cocaine. And once I started selling cocaine, man, it just took me into another world. So I was just robbing people. I was making a lot more money. I began to be a lot more flashier, and I just think it just all went to my head.
He described how he, Wallace, and 3 other teenagers had been driving around Fairbanks, high on alcohol and cocaine, looking for someone to rob. They spotted Hartman walking alone and decided to make him their target. The attack was swift and brutal, with each member of the group taking turns beating the helpless boy. Holmes admitted that he had delivered the final fatal blows. The confessions of Wallace and Holmes provided a wealth of information that corroborated the physical evidence from the crime scene. They knew details that only the true perpetrators could have known: the exact location of Hartman's body, the nature of his injuries, and even the items that had been stolen from him. This new information cast a dark shadow over the convictions of the Fairbanks Four, raising serious questions about the integrity of the original investigation and prosecution. Despite the compelling nature of these confessions, justice remained elusive for the Fairbanks Four. The legal system, which had moved so swiftly to convict them, now seemed to grind to a halt when faced with evidence of their innocence. The fight to free the Fairbanks Four entered its final, most challenging phase, as their advocates worked tirelessly to bring this new information to light. The revelations about Wallace and Holmes sent shockwaves through the Fairbanks community. Many who had believed in the guilt of the Fairbanks Four were forced to confront the possibility that they had been wrong all along. The case had exposed deep-seated racial tensions and biases within the criminal justice system, and now it threatened to undermine public trust in local law enforcement and the courts. In December 2015, after nearly 2 decades behind bars, the Fairbanks Four were finally released. Their freedom, however, came at a price. In exchange for their release, they were required to sign a settlement agreement that prevented them from suing the state for wrongful conviction. This controversial deal left many questioning the true motives of the Alaskan justice system. The case of the Fairbanks Four exposed deep-rooted issues within Alaska's criminal justice apparatus. It revealed a system plagued by racial bias, coerced confessions, and a disturbing willingness to overlook exculpatory evidence. The aftermath sparked calls for comprehensive reform, including improved interrogation practices, enhanced forensic capabilities, and increased oversight of prosecutorial conduct. Despite their release, the shadow of John Hartman's murder continues to loom over Fairbanks. The true perpetrators, Jason Wallace and William Holmes, have yet to face charges for this specific crime. Their confessions, while pivotal in freeing the Fairbanks Four, have not resulted in further legal action. This unresolved aspect of the case serves as a chilling reminder of the complexities and imperfections inherent in the pursuit of justice.